This is Halleck Hoffman speaking from the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. The center was established by the Fund for the Republic to study whether and how a free and just society may be maintained under the strikingly new political, social, economic, and technological conditions of the 20th century. The method of study is dialogue and discussion. During 1963, the summer months were devoted to the center's continuing study of law, jurisprudence, and the Bill of Rights. The broadcast that follows is one of 4 seminars held to consider a theory of the First Amendment, proposed by Joseph Tussman, professor of philosophy at the University of California. Mr. Tussman, who is preparing on the subject a book tentatively titled The Government of the Mind, suggests a theory that reads the First Amendment as protecting and encouraging the active participation of the citizen in political affairs. Since government already assumes responsibility for protecting the body of the citizen, as through pure food and drug laws, weights and measures specifications, and so on, why, asked Mr. Tussman, should it not also assume similar responsibility for protecting the moral and intellectual development of the mind? Participating in the meeting are the chairman, Mr. Robert Hutchins, Alexander Meiklejohn, former president of Amherst College, Harry Calvin, Jr. of the University of Chicago Law School, Purcell Weaver, and staff members Frank Kelly, W.H. Ferry, William Gorman, Harvey Wheeler, Harry Ashmore, Richard Lichtman, and John Wilkinson. Although the participants were sympathetic to Mr. Tussman's proposition in general, there was sharp dissent on the particulars. The discussion, of which the following is the second of 4, is being presented both for the subject and as an example of the dialectic process at work in a dialogue that is characteristic of discussions at the center, and which Mr. Robert M. Hutchins once described to an audience in this way.
The Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions is a group of men meeting continuously and trying to think, I will not say how successfully, about the most urgent problems which in their opinion now confront us. The purpose of the organization is not merely to think, not merely to try to think together, not merely to offer a model of an intellectual community or to suggest how the dialogue may be carried on and the civilization of the dialogue achieved. The purpose of the center is to try to clarify the most important issues that we now face and to try to get these issues discussed by those who may in some way or other determine what shall be done about them. Every day at 11 o'clock, one of the staff or a visitor, of whom we have some 300 during the year from all over the world, is required to present a statement, is required to subject himself to cross-examination, and then he's required to go out and think it over. We do believe that we confront a totally new world. We believe that the rate of change is unexampled. We believe that it is only by taking thought that we may hope to save the West and perpetuate those ideals of freedom and justice to which we are all dedicated.
And now Mr. Tussman, as he begins the second day's discussion of his book, The Government of the Mind.
The image I have of myself in relation to the problem this morning is not that of threading my way carefully through a jungle, but I rather see the problem looming as a boulder against which I intend to hurl myself a number of times, bounce back, and tackle it again. So I start with the assumption, which I think is not really subject to serious challenge, that Congress or government may do a great deal to aid, encourage, facilitate, and increase the freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition. That nothing in the Constitution can in any way be interpreted as forbidding activity which aids and fosters in a variety of ways. Now, by way of aiding, and I think there is no problem, we may have a system of mails, we may subsidize publications, we may provide public buildings, we may maintain the streets and parks and other buildings as forums, we may maintain libraries, help to establish and administer radio and television facilities, protect authors through copyright, government publishing. In general, the provisions for an adequate forum fall clearly within the responsibility of government, and no one has argued that government activity devoted to increasing the communication life and facilitating it is in any way precluded, and I think can be said to be a positive responsibility of government. Now, the second point is that government may also, beyond this, regulate the forum with respect to such things quite obviously as time, place, and manner. It can, without abridging in any sense the freedom of speech, make rules about the conditions under which the streets may be used for demonstrations, who parades today and who tomorrow, how crowds must behave, whether doorbells can be rung, whether the telephone could be used as an indiscriminate way of intruding, under what conditions people can capture audiences, where billboards can be put, the use of sound trucks, quiet zones, equal time. None of these regulations constitute, it seems to me in any significant sense, an abridgment of the freedom of speech. Now, the analogy I think that one might draw, although it shifts the issue, is this. The existence of Robert's Rules of Order, or the Senate Manual of Order, or whatever it is, cannot significantly be said to abridge the freedom of speech of the Senate. It just defines the conditions. These rules may very well be used in some circumstances to do the sort of things which we would regard as an abridgment, but the existence of such rules is a necessary condition for having speech. And as Professor Meiklejohn has pointed out in other connections, the first thing the moderator does when he calls a meeting to order, in order that speech may occur, is to shout silence and stop everybody's unregulated talkativeness. So I take it that there's a vast area which fall clearly within the responsibility of government and don't raise any questions of the First Amendment. And I want to push this a little further, however, and ask whether or not, with the suggestion that there's a positive answer, the mind of the community or individuals cannot receive even more administrative aid by the bureaucracy, putting it in a crude term, as it finds itself in the communication situation. Whether we seem to operate with the concept of an omnicompetent mind, so trained and developed as a result of the educational process that it is utterly competent to deal with every assault on it. When a statement is made, it goes through all of the procedures of scientific method, assesses, weighs, evaluates, does all these things, and is capable on its own of arriving at a responsible judgment as to the truth of the utterance. But suppose we consider whether government might have some regulatory functions which aid the mind in arriving at a sound, responsible judgment. Now, I raise this question in two forms. To what extent can we demand administrative guarantee of the truth of statements made which enter into the stream of communication? Now, I think it's quite clear that in many areas we do count on bureaucratic help, and we relieve the mind, competent as it might be, of some of its burdens in this respect. When I walk into a supermarket and pick up a can of something, and it says 13 net ounces, I can weigh things myself. I could conceivably, if I remembered, construct a scale and test the truth of that statement. But I'm relying on a bureaucrat somewhere, a government official, to relieve my mind of that strain upon its attention. And I'm depending on a Bureau of Weights and Measures to periodically inspect to see that the scales are accurate, that statements that no preservative has been added, and so forth. All of these things are, if one seeks to describe them, simply bureaucratic guarantees of truth in some areas. Now, obviously, the minute you raise the question of the administrative guarantee of truth as not incompatible with the guarantee of the freedom of communication, one immediately thinks of the areas in which we do not want to depend on an administrative determination of truth. And perhaps the area in which we can insist on non-deceptive utterances, like the omission of liver from Carter's little liver pills, and a number of things of this sort, may be fairly limited, although the principle in terms of which one limits it is not at all easy to state. Well, I raise this question because I think the general notion that government may not concern itself with the content or the truth is a dogma that we too easily accept, and that there are areas in which we count on the administrative concern for the truth, quite apart from other areas in which we punish perjury, which is simply another form of the attempt of the government through sanctions to assure the truth of items of communication. In such areas as we are unwilling to push the administrative guarantee of truth in this form, I think it's perfectly natural to see the regulative administrative concern for the presenting to the mind of the judger, of the person, something in the way of balance. That is, the provisions that both sides be heard can take extremely crude and vulgar forms and inappropriate forms, and to a certain extent the context of reflection may be broader than this single occasion. But the notion that if access to the channels of communication are granted for the statement in an area in which we say this is a matter of opinion, we won't guarantee the truth. The concern with the making available the counter-opinion, counter-judgment, is one which, well, has to be considered. Now, some of our crude forms of this may take early statement, equal time on TV, and obviously we need a great deal of refinement, and we have to consider perhaps the broader context. The University of California's rule for the moment that if you have speakers of a certain sort, they have to submit themselves to questions. They may in some cases be required to appear only if somebody from the other side can, may be fairly crude, and in some cases may even be unwise. But I think the principle that beyond the guaranteeing of truth, the guaranteeing or provision for something in the way of counter-argument is not an unreasonable administrative demand, which would seem to me not to fall afoul of any requirement that we not abridge the freedom of speech. I want to raise even one further problem. Suppose we raise the question of the changed context of communication. With some oversimplification, I think it could be said that a generation ago, most of the communication occurred in a context which provided the listener or the participant, the recipient of communication, the context which provided him with a number of significant clues which aided his interpretation and assessment of what was said. Most of the time, the talk we heard was by people with whom we were closely associated. You didn't imagine a situation in which you didn't have television, radio. Most of the talking that went on that you were subjected to, for the most part, was in a familiar community context. You knew the speaker. You knew his habits. You knew how much to discount. You knew when a grain of salt was needed. You knew who was Honest John, who was reliable, who was Chicken Little. The whole range of experience with a person helped evaluate a particular utterance. Now, there is a genetic fallacy that you're all familiar with. The truth of a statement is in some sense independent of whoever utters it. Nevertheless, in many situations, part of our judgment as to whether to accept the truth of a statement depends very heavily on our judgment of the reliability and the judgment of the person who's making the utterance. But now, that context, which provided us with significant interpretive clues, has largely been removed in the current situation. You now watch a television program. You see somebody very earnestly looking at you. You're not sure whether he's looking at you or looking at the prompting board, so you don't even know to begin with whether he's reading it or making it up as he goes along. Then you don't know whether he wrote it. Then you don't know whether he believes it, or whether he is, as a matter of fact, a paid performer. And furthermore, you may not know who paid him to say it. And yet you're presented with all of the theatrical arts. You're confronted with somebody, and all of these other things are stripped away. Now, suppose one says in this situation, is it legitimate to restore to the context of communication some of the clues which are relevant to the interpretation and evaluation of this, restoring this? And this brings up, now we do this in many ways. Essentially, let me shorten and perhaps vulgarize this by saying this is the problem of labeling, which I think needs to be considered very carefully. To say that the person who has just made this enthusiastic speech about the joys of the beaches in the Dominican Republic is in the employ of the Dominican Republic as a public relations man, he may be saying things which are true, but nevertheless I would find that the addition of that information to that context helps me interpret it. I would like to know whether the doctor who is saying earnestly that the case for the relation between cigarette smoking and cancer hasn't been made is working for a cigarette company. He may be right. I don't mean to substitute the one question for another, but I'm not sure it's not a relevant bit of information which restores to what would have normally been a familiar situation, something that because of the new situation is not there as a part of it. There is something behind the sometimes barbaric urge that a person label what he says. And the notion that a person is now subjected to, let's say, a lush magazine that is sent through the mails and arrives about the conditions in Yugoslavia or England or Vietnam. Who did it? Where does it come from? some concern for the identification of this, although it will later seem to me to run counter to another principle which has to be adjusted to it, is not illegitimate. Yeah.
Saying that the reporter reports the remarks of a man is very critical of capitalism, has any obligation to say that this man is a Marxist, or would that make many of his readers not read his statements? What in that case?
Well, of course, I think in the case you mentioned, the Scott thing, it was quite, I remember this as an episode, somebody reporting Baran's statements critical, not mentioning that he was a Marxist. It was quite apparent from the statements that he was. In a particular environment, raising a slogan may very well keep somebody from reading what is said. I don't know how to answer that easily.
All of the anonymity and frontism that may be present in television was traditionally present with regard to the written word, yes, even under the community conditions that you regard nostalgically.
It wasn't nostalgically, well, but they have passed, and I think we have a different situation.
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But the point of it is that this is not a qualitatively new situation with regard to
writing. I had in mind when I spoke of that primarily the spoken communication.
John, I anticipate disagreeing with you on this point later, but I don't yet. I want to be sure that isn't all you said so far, is that this proposition that the government supplement the clues that we get in impersonal communication is not per se unthinkable. I mean,
that's right.
It's not, you haven't discussed at all how far you extend it and so forth.
Although it always demoralizes me to have a long speech summed up as isn't all you're saying.
I didn't mean it.
That's true.
I didn't intend that particular gambit either.
But I want to point out to one of the functions that government may undertake increasingly, we're a little leery of this. It does run counter to another principle which is represented by the secret ballot, which feels that in order to facilitate communication, under some conditions, it's necessary to immunize the person against some of the consequences of the fair and candid expression of his views. And this may very well spill over into a defense or re-examination of the legitimacy, the defense of anonymity with respect to publications, or even on certain man-in-the-street programs. I've seen a number of these programs where you get somebody, and there's a kind of, what's your name and where do you live? And I heard it once, and people do this routinely. And what do you think of the Cubans? And then there's a kind of favorable remark. And I once heard them say, "What did you say your name and address was?" This kind of thing. There are many situations in which a person wants to, and it would be useful for us to have his views without subjecting him to the kind of consequences of identification. But I think there are two principles that need some kind of reconciling here and some very careful judgment. But I think, so far as my principle about the government of communication is concerned, I think one has to seriously consider the problem of labeling as a legitimate one. Although my own reactions to this, I must admit, have been heavily influenced by what I regard as improper, harassing demands, so that I approach it with some antipathy. Although when one asks, should lobbyists register? For instance, should a person testifying before a congressional committee say he's representing this industry as part of the situation, seems to me we accept this quite freely. And I think this is a principle, however, that we have to consider as we deal with the government's control of the communication situation. Well, suppose we now turn, after this introduction, which reminds us of some of the things that government may do to facilitate, and probably should do, to facilitate the communication life, to consider what government may not do. And here I turn to the First Amendment and make some passing comments. The amendment is formulated as Congress, let's say, shall not abridge. The two crucial notions are abridge and the freedom of speech, or press, assembly, petition, which for purposes of convenience I'll simply keep referring to, I guess, as communication, with some allowances if you'll give them to me. Now, the interesting question is always, how does the 14th Amendment make the first applicable against the states? And you look to three clauses: privileges and immunities, that is, no state may abridge the privileges and immunities of a citizen of the United States. I don't want to get into that except to say, and perhaps it comes out, that it was a sad chapter perhaps in the history, when the privileges and immunities clause was interpreted in that sense, in the light of the federal system also, as holding that most of the privileges you had and immunities you had by virtue of being a citizen of a state. And the only privileges and immunities that were at stake in the 14th Amendment were those privileges and immunities which accrued to you solely by virtue of what was added because we had a federal system, like the right to go from one state to another. And that became the interpretation of it which knocked that out as a way. So the tradition has been not to look at that, although occasionally there's a wistful hope that it might be re-examined. The next was the Equal Protection Clause, which was also seen as not quite doing that, although it had something to do with equal opportunity, perhaps. The last clause was the Due Process Clause. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Among these three is life, liberty, liberty. Well, then I guess the thing was liberty includes such liberty of communication or liberty as is necessary or is built into the conception of ordered freedom. And you now have to work out what that means. But among the other consequences of it is that it says this shall not be abridged except by due process of law, so that whatever it is somehow abridgeable. Well, it gets so, the choice of one or the other of these formulations, made applicable against the states by the 14th without specifying of how it's done, and tracing it made applicable through the operation of the Due Process Clause, which apparently would give it a much limited scope, is a kind of fighting issue and a clue to how one wing or the other of the court is initially approaching this. Oddly enough, it wasn't until we think of the first as made applicable against the states by the 14th that we were ever confronted with the problem of saying what it was that free speech meant. Because of the fact that, for instance, the formulation, Congress may not abridge what the states may, and neither may the states. Since that makes no sense, you have to then examine the conception of freedom of speech, which, if you're going to say neither can now do it, that neither can do, because you can no longer define what cannot be done by saying this government can't do what that may. You now have to define for the first time what freedom of speech means. So now it becomes incumbent on us to look to what it was that even the state, in some sense, ought not to be doing in this area.
It seems to me that you're belaboring the pre-14th Amendment constitutional history in a sort of an indefensible way. The 14th Amendment was a product of the Civil War, and a whole lot of decisions were taken by that. And I think that clearly, in almost any reading you give it, the result of that war was to reduce these powers of the states that they previously had had, and in effect to declare everybody a citizen of the United States, and therefore in a new way protected by the guarantees in the Constitution. Yes. I think that's what the 14th
Well, yes,
said.
I don't challenge that the 14th in some way does work a revolution in federalism, but you see the court has never really come to the notion that it simply, in a blanket way, I think, makes the whole Bill of Rights applicable. It's a matter of picking and choosing, some of the things which are and some are not. And while I grant that the First Amendment, I don't challenge the First Amendment's, the free speech thing as moving over, I simply point to some of the difficulties, especially as they involve us for the first time, in some sense, in defining and thinking about the concept of free speech. But I don't want to belabor the obvious on this. Now, so this is my first run against the boulder, and now, having reached the point where one has to think about what it is, what the freedom of speech is that we are in some sense not to abridge, I want to say something about that. And I start the second run by describing communication as a consequential human activity. It's an activity, and it's consequential, and it's special in that it involves the relation of one mind to another, which distinguishes it from other kind of activity. It is, as a matter of fact, a pretty good example of what one means by a mental act. An act isn't an act of communication unless at least one side of it is this relating of one mind to the other. This is not very exciting, but calling it an action suggests initially that it has to be dealt with as one of a whole class of human actions, which we normally say have to be regulated, permitted, or controlled in the light of the consequences of this action for individuals and for the social and the general good. I think I start here with some difference, for instance, from Emerson's notion as he approached the First Amendment we talked about some time ago, in which he simply started with freedom of expression as something that was absolutely, in principle, immunized, wanting to think of it as thought and not entering into the notion of action and talking about curbing it only when it becomes an act of a certain sort and harmful. I'd like to start here with the obvious notion that it's a kind of activity which is interwoven with all other kinds of activities and is mutually affected in many ways by it. And that a characteristic feature of communication activity is its jostling character, its aggressive, intrusive, assaulting, consequential character. I just jotted down a whole list of not a whole list. I started to make a list of some of the communicating words, and you're suddenly horrified by the aggressive character and the intrusive character of these. Start with some milder than others. Teaching, debating, advising, deliberating, evaluating, persuading, admonishing, convincing, criticizing, praising, condemning, comforting, inspiring, sustaining, consoling, seducing, informing, deceiving, concealing, attacking, inciting, enticing, entertaining, shocking, humiliating, alienating, subverting, disillusioning, warning, threatening. Well, I could go on, I guess. Yeah, but I'm not so much shocked by that they're all transitive verbs, but that they have, so many of them have this kind of assaulting character that I call here intrusive and jostling. So that it suggests that communication activity is among all hard to think of as not having another side and spilling over into activity and affecting. So that saying, it seems to me initially, is a kind of doing, and as such peculiarly subject, because of its consequences, to control in terms of its effects. Now, let me develop this a little and take the notion of the verbal assault and the attack in several categories of it. Traditionally, it's the verbal attack or verbal assault or harm to a person. The kind of verbal attacks that take the form of the systematic verbal destruction of a person's self-confidence in intimate relationships, nagging, things of this sort, which are dreadful forms of aggression, but which for the moment I don't want to pass a law about, although the stock for the nag was not an unknown colonial remedy or something of this sort. But let me leave this side by side with communing with oneself for the moment. I'm just pointing to the fact that verbal activity, seen innocently, is very aggressive and consequential, and as a matter of fact, traditionally has never been regarded as immune from the normal kinds of controls designed to protect individuals. And just some of the quick list. I say I put aside these terrible ones about nagging and the puncturing of self-esteem and the undermining of confidence that go on in relations, which are very harmful. But the notion of hurting a person's reputation, his standing in the community, in an earlier age his honor, and now I suppose its equivalent is his credit rating. His standing in the community. Blackmail is an interesting crime. It's the threat to communicate. Kind of odd sort of business. It never raised a free speech problem, but it might someday, or shouldn't. But at any rate, forms of assault, verbal assault on an individual take these forms. There are the attack on a person's livelihood. We're familiar and quite reconciled to customer stealing as a legitimate form of communication. But it wasn't so long ago that customer stealing was regarded as immoral, and it still persists in some of the professions where it's not regarded as appropriate for a doctor to advertise, to take somebody else's customer away. And guild regulations earlier would have said that a person has a right to his customers in some sense. I mean, you're taking the bread out of his children's mouth. Stealing his customers is a form of verbal activity that was not regarded as legitimate. Another category is the luring of individuals into illegal action. The whole class of activities of this sort, which we attempt to regulate in the form of sometimes prevention, sometimes punishment, or the seducing of individuals into harmful patterns of life or addiction. I guess the possibility now that we may pass laws preventing or trying to curtail the seduction of youngsters into tobacco addiction. I don't want to make more of a point of this than that if one starts to examine what our historical attitude has been, we start with the heavy assumption that communication activity, which is an assault on an individual in many ways, is normally subject to control without any difficulty, and that these are not regarded as significantly an abridgment on the freedom of speech, or rather define legitimate speech activity. There are some, yeah.
You're going too fast with the last ones. I mean,
well, then I'll drop that last one because I'll come back to that concept of legitimate speech activity later. Okay?
Okay.
Joe, I'd like to ask one.
Wait a minute now. I don't understand that Mr. Tussman has opened himself to questions. These interruptions, therefore, must be regarded as impolite. Isn't that your view?
No. Do you want me to?
No, I want to get clear on the
this one, I put that one off because I injudiciously used a phrase which I haven't built up to. What I'm trying to build up here is just sort of the acceptance of the notion that it was perfectly normal, as one thinks, of what it was the states could do, that they didn't have a barrier to overcome of an insuperable sort, that communication was subject to control where it was of this nature. Now, we now have new forms of this, the extension of this. We're even thinking of there are some states have passed laws making it impossible to libel a group, for instance, and there is the Beauharnais case. And I just want to mention in passing that the notion of assault, this notion of libel, is in some people's minds wisely extended to cover more than an individual, but a group like Negroes, Jews, so forth. So beyond the assault on the individual, which I'm just touching on here, suppose we consider the assault on institutions. Now, the assault on institutions, we had a notion of seditious libel, the notion of seditious libel, that is assault on government, which was any communication, I guess, which was designed to bring the government into disrepute and to weaken the respect for its authority. It was taken as a standard crime. Now, in connection with seditious libel, which for interesting reasons has been held generally, although not to be applicable to the United States simply by virtue of the fact that we have a system of self-government and a number of other, the reasons why we never, with whatever qualifications are necessary, accepted seditious libel here is that we somehow thought from the beginning that the criticism of government was okay. In connection with the assault on an institution, I would like to, although I'll shortcut it here, I just want to indicate what needs to be developed. I have a whole chapter or series of the development of the theory of criticism and the attempt to separate criticism from illegitimate assault. And the giving of advice, and to distinguish that from criticism has been very difficult. And I'm intrigued by some of the earlier Greek stabs at it in a way. Socrates' attempt to institutionalize the critic, the appeal there at the moment was rejected in some way. But if you go back earlier, the notion of advice given in the form of oracles, sort of surrounded by an aura, or the person who was going to say what was the case with impunity, Cassandra. Cassandra, well, you didn't have to worry about her because it was so arranged that although she would say what would happen in a kind of prophetic way, presumably, she was fated not to be believed. Or Tiresias was already blind, so what could you do with him? And it kind of inspired the protecting of the earlier forms of saying things in an environment in which it was even routine, if a messenger brought you bad news, to regard him as somebody who could be executed. The difficulty of protecting certain kinds of statements in the presence of authority. Now, part of this history is the court fool, which always intrigues me, the Shakespearean fool in Lear. Kent, you remember, says, don't do that, that's a foolish thing to do, out of my kingdom, like 24 hours. Kind of thing. But there's the fool saying things, who is in a sense licensed to tell the truth and is the precursor of His Majesty's loyal opposition, as far as I can see. But who is surrounded by all sorts of very peculiar sanctions to make sure, or conditions to make sure that although he can say what is the case, can say anything he wants, he's licensed to do this, it's only because he's an idiot or because he's different or that the price he pays is quite a drastic one. The development from that to the notion of the protected advisor the leader, His Majesty's loyal opposition, the Parliament, which can say what it pleases and does not have to answer in another place, the conception of legitimate criticism, and even then conducted by someone who qualifies as a critic because he accepts an underlying consensus and therefore is licensed, to even the licensing of the critic or the toleration of the critic who rejects the basic premises of the enterprise would make, I think, an interesting story in the development of the emergence from the conception initially of assault, the emergence of the conception of criticism, which, well, I leave that. But that's connected with the notion of the assault on authority of the state seditious libel, which, as I say, we start with the tradition which makes this a perfectly plausible thing to do. Very quickly, other institutions have been protected. Blasphemy and sacrilege, I think, are in part analogous attempts to protect religious institutions from the undermining of their authority and respect or their position, to immunize them against certain kinds of criticism. The court, as you know, in the Miracle case, said that the implications of the separation of church and state is that there is no right of religion to be free from skepticism or attacks on this, so that the doctrine there is that blasphemy really has no legitimate status in America, although if one tries to, remember the last time he heard an atheist on Sunday morning expounding his views on radio or television, and may have to go back to the time when a test case was forced by a Palo Alto atheist who fought it as a matter of free speech and did get 15 minutes and got such a pile of letters that that was his last 15 minutes. That some of the things still operate in odd ways to make quite clear that although we may not have a formal protection of some institutions in law, there are all sorts of odd situations with respect to the attack on religion. Just as a catch-all, I would say that it's also possible to make an assault on taboos of a certain sort. And the whole notion of a taboo, the notion that there should be words which are shocking, is a very ancient one. And I suppose the obscenity problem, that is, the words would somehow intrude on some of the social taboos, has, although there's fighting issues with respect to it, nevertheless, it's an aspect of the assaulting character of speech which we regarded as subject to control. Well, against this general background, I would suppose that it's better, as we try to approach the question of what the freedom of speech is, to start with the notion that expression, verbal expression, is naturally, normally regulable in terms of the harm that is likely to result to individuals and to the common good. And the problem from this point has been the history of the development of freedom of communication has been the history of the development of notions which have cut into the normal restraints on communication and immunized it from certain kinds of its normal consequences. And the chief weapon in this development is what I take to be the most significant notion of privilege, or privileged communication. The notion of privilege, I think it really involves two notions. It's very closely connected with the notion of a function. In explaining what privilege is, one has to deal with the conception of a function. But privilege itself involves, I think, two things. The shielding of persons from the normal consequences of otherwise normal consequences of his communication activity, and the, although it's not perhaps another thing, protection against disclosure in another place. That is the protection of secrecy or privacy. I want to bring in the phrase here because I always like it. Protection against having to answer in another place for what he says here in this relationship. Now, essentially, then, it's the protecting or immunizing of the individual from a range of normal consequences. And the privileged relationship is, I think, essentially the advisory relationship. That is, what situations do we privilege? Partly advisory. If you look to, for instance, the relation between a lawyer and his client, between a doctor and his patient, between a priest and his parishioner. Now, every one of these is characterized as, it seems to me, to be a relationship which society has judged valuable and wants to protect because it's either valuable in itself somehow or it can be said to perform an important social function. And in order to perform this function and to flourish as an institution, it has to be immunized and in some sense licensed. And the notion of privilege then comes to bear to shield this relationship from what I would here regard as the normal consequences of aggressive activity. Now, the clearest, the most interesting case of this, I always think, the paradigm for me is Congress, the freedom of speech that, let's say, a senator has. For whatever he says on the floor of the House, taking the fruit of the whole English parliamentary struggle, he shall not be made to answer in another place. He's free of libel, free of slander, harassment, which are the normal things. And the conception is that, why are we doing this? Because in order for him to perform his function, he has to be freed of this harassment. Not that we want him to indulge in libel or slander, but we've got to free him of the possible consequences. Yeah?
Joe, are all the privileges that you have mentioned established in law?
Yes. I think one makes a distinction between absolute privilege and between relative privilege and maybe a shifting area.
There's an ambiguity there, and I don't know if it makes any difference to your point, because I would think you're better off with the popular sense of privilege than the legal one. But some of your examples are privileges in the sense of the law of evidence, that you're privileged not to disclose as a witness the information.
Yeah.
Which seems to me not terribly helpful to somewhat relevant to some of the ideas you've got here. The other is that it's a privileged form it's presumptively wrong, and in this instance it's privileged like self-defense. I mean, and you can't be held to answer for it legally.
I want to keep the first one, however, as a part of it, because it does seem to me very important as bearing on the whole conception of the right of privacy and the right of the non-disclosure problem, especially, for instance, as it bears on congressional investigations.
Instead of starting with the idea of a privileged speech and then requiring the opposition to provide some reason for abridging it, you start essentially with the notion of abridgment and then require that some reason be shown, in this case, a function which you regard as being socially valuable.
What I'd like to ask...
I think not only reverse it, I think there are better grounds for my position.
Well, Judge, may I ask, I think that sort of fascinates me, because I wonder, does that make any difference? Is that a verbal trick we're applying? Does it make any difference which way you put this?
I think it does. You mean as between one or the other?
Yeah, whether you're on the inside or the outside. Is the glass half full or half empty? Isn't that kind of a question?
No,
I think it isn't, but I think it's worth looking at.
I think it forces you to deal with ideas in one case which are relevant to the problem of the dealing with new situations and expanding and trying to understand what you're doing. The other, you're forced almost to rely on the fact that we've done things in this way always. What puzzles me or troubles me in the whole free speech area is the weakness of the general rationale and understanding of the situation with which we approach it. So that I have a great deal of confidence in how far one can ride the notion of privilege, and I stated initially in a kind of, it's not altogether a popular, but in a non-technical notion way.
Of course, as far as the law of evidence is concerned, you can't ride it very far. Because the lawyers have guaranteed themselves this protection on behalf of their clients, but they don't extend it to priests in the confessional. They don't extend it to reporters, two of whom are now in jail in England.
Psychoanalysts, take care.
And the question as to whether it's worth doing or whether we ought to do it is in many ways open. I would suppose, for instance, that it's not altogether clear what the relation between the requirement of FBI disclosure to the FBI of a teacher's knowledge of his student's mind. I've argued, and others have taken the view, that this is privileged for the same reason, that it would destroy the integrity of the intellectual process if information of this sort were made available, and you wouldn't have teaching if this were generally known, and that this is then an overriding concern to which the other has to defer. But I don't mean that it's clear. I think that all I'm saying is that this is an area in which we don't initially have so much questions of constitutionality as wisdom. And that I want to hope that the result of this whole thing is that many more questions become not constitutional questions, but problems of wisdom. What this adds up to is now, if we try to say, what is the system of freedom of speech? I now offer the following. The system of freedom of speech is the system of protected opportunities for communication. It's the system of protected opportunities. Now, the notion of protection, this is why I've made this so central, because it's not a state of nature notion. No one can be said to have free speech in the absence of a whole structure where you're simply talking and fighting. There you may have the power to say something, you don't have a right of freedom of speech. The two notions which are irreducible and indispensable are the notion of an opportunity for communication and protection. Now let me elaborate on this a little. Any system of communication which allowed you to say anything you wanted at any time, but punished you for virtually everything you said, would not be regarded by us as a system of freedom of speech. Or if you were utterly immunized from the consequences of whatever you said. You could never be punished for what you said, but you were carefully guarded against having any opportunity to say anything. You obviously wouldn't regard that as a system of freedom of speech. That is, the notion of free speech is the notion of an opportunity to enter into the communication life. That's an indispensable notion. And behind that, a whole range of what I've indicated earlier, the necessities for the provision of adequate forms, the guaranteeing of access to forms is involved. And then you wouldn't have it unless you also had a system of protection, which immunized you against some of the range of the normal consequences of this. And both of these are essential. Now, for an individual to say that I enjoy freedom of speech is to say I am or have access to the system of protected opportunities for communication. But this isn't in the end enough, because we now have to say, what does it mean to say that a state has a system of free speech? Well, first of all, that it's maintaining a system of protected opportunities. And I think we now have to then quickly see, Congress shall not abridge the system of protected opportunities provided by the states on the earlier Federalist reading. Federal reading would be all right. But then neither Congress nor the state may abridge the system of protected opportunities. Doesn't quite make sense unless one has an independent way of determining what the system of protected opportunities is or ought to be. So that I think one is quickly forced to, an addition really, that I'm uneasy about it, the notion of an appropriate structure or system of protected opportunities. So that the First Amendment now reads, the government shall maintain and develop an appropriate system of protected opportunities of communication. Now, Under the notion of appropriate, I want to suggest there are two kinds of considerations. One, appropriate because they're somehow presupposed by or implied by the enterprise. That is appropriate in the way that provisions for freedom of speech for the citizen, for the voter, or for a senator, is implied by having the responsibility, by a Republican form of government, for instance. If you're committed to a self-governing body politic like ours, appropriate would here mean that the electorate has to have, in effect, the same kind of freedom of speech and protection, in the sense, that a congressman has, for instance, in the performance of his function. And that this is not entirely a case of wisdom, this is a good arrangement, but that it's somehow implied by the structure of the institutions, that if you didn't have it, you wouldn't have a democratic, it's constitutive almost of the democratic order, rather than something that is wisely adopted.
Same kind of freedom. The electorate should have the same kind of freedom as a congressman. Are you talking about anything other than a comparable immunity to libel?
The right to investigate, to read, to discuss, to assemble, to debate, to speak, and the privilege of not having to answer in another place.
Well,
as well as, in some cases, exemption from libel when it's in the course of the legitimate political discussion.
I'm trying to figure two things. I don't quite understand this. The first part of it seems to be clear. There's a lecturer is now limited by libel laws in a way that the congressman is not. Are you also suggesting that the lecturer necessarily ought to have the same kind of machinery available to him to investigate, to get an audience?
One of Joe's remark is that the government is to maintain and develop the system.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yes, therefore, there's certain positive responsibilities on the government to achieve certain
And I would take the congressional thing. For instance, I think if you're going to turn over certain fundamental decisions to the electorate, the same justification that has been brought to give Congress an implied power to investigate, to discover the fact, is that if they're going to legislate, they have to have access to the information that they need to legislate intelligently. They have to have opportunities for exchanging views, for communication and freedom, and some kinds of protection. And I would argue the citizen has to have the same thing in his political function.
That jumps right over the representative notion, doesn't it?
I don't see how.
Well, in terms of speech, I can't see that the congressman has anything I don't have except the immunity and the privilege of his position. In terms of, and also an automatic forum where he can always have an audience. Now, what else has he got?
Well, he's got, for instance, the right. If he were to be a communist, he could say what he wanted. And speak in the halls of Congress and not have to answer in another place. And I'm not clear that if a member of the electorate is a communist, he would have that kind of access to the right to enter into the communication life of the society.
Suppose you were to take Joe's position and say, and your position as well. What's the next step? The next step is that the government, under his formula, has to try to develop an analogous forum for you to the one that the congressman has achieved.
I'm just trying to understand the implications of this. You take the example you use of a communist member of Congress, obviously would have an audience. He'd have a forum.
Yes.
A private citizen who's a communist could, I think, say most of the same things, but he probably wouldn't be heard and he might be shouted down.
And he might have to answer in another place.
That's right. The congressman, in another sense, would have to answer too. The reason we don't have a communist congressman is that he couldn't get elected. So in a sense, I'm not sure that he'd have much greater latitude except temporarily.
Well, but now look, I don't know exactly where it worked out, but it seems to me the experience of recent years has been full of tendencies of government officials to want to interfere with the communication life of the electorate by exposing, subjecting to sanctions through the payroll route, the curbing, making it difficult to get a hold of publications of certain sorts, making it almost fraught with consequences to ask for the delivery of certain kinds of communication, which interfere with the communication activity of a voter as he tries to form his views about what kind of a society we ought to have and what we ought to do and the kind of people who ought to be elected and what ideas ought to be pushed. And what I'm arguing here is simply taking Dr. Mickeljohn's view just whole hog as far as I can. The principle which is applied here, if we see it as the application of the notion of the extension of the privilege of a public official, with whatever differences the difference between the electoral tribunal and others involve as a practical matter, we understand it better than the court has understood this question when on all of these subversive speech so-called issues, what it has said is, on the one hand, we have the interests of the government, on the other hand, we have the desire of a private individual to say what he wants, to express himself. And this has been a wildly irrelevant and misleading formulation, because what we really had is, on the one hand, we've had the representative trying to do something. On the other hand, we have a citizen, that is to say, a member of the sovereign, trying to discharge his political functions. And the clash between these two situations is far different from the clash between an official performing a public function and claiming the freedom necessary for that, and a private person's claim to self-expression. And there's been a drastic failure of understanding at that point, which I think has consequences for the way we've dealt with some issues.
I'm still not entirely clear on what your remedy is. I don't deny it.
This is a post question. I mean, the question on the table, as it seems to me, as to whether Joe's argument leads properly to the assertion of an obligation and a valid power on the part of government to provide mutatis mutandis for the electorate, the citizenry, something analogous to what is supplied for the instrumental government. Now, apart from what would be at stake when he proceeded to supply that, what items did he have in mind? The first assertion is whether or not his argument has led to the assertion that generally. And any questions about what does he have in mind by way of implementing it are posterior ones.
You would make no distinction in terms of the right of communication between an elected responsible official and any private citizen.
Private citizen? I'm not talking about him in his capacity as a private citizen. His desire to sell mattresses I would not put as a very important communication demand compared to his desire to discuss
as an individual
policies.
elector. You would attempt to remove any distinction between an individual elector and a member of Congress who is charged with a public responsibility.
Yeah, that is to say, I would say the citizen is charged, like the congressman, with a public responsibility which needs the same protection for his communication life as the other does. It's simply the application of the principle of privileged communication to this, which I think was the latent theory of free speech before the clear and present danger principle came in, and not in the sense provided an alternative, but changed the subject by focusing what I think might in some sense be acceptable as a principle in terms of which you deal with riots, which thing.
I'm not aware myself of being deprived of anything that a congressman has. It does not seem to me to properly accrue to his office.
Well, I would suppose the concrete issue which I think has been posed here.
It shows it's a good country. I mean, that's
it may be we're in good shape, but suppose how would you deal with the issue about the demand of a congressional investigating committee that a member of the electorate appear before it and reveal his political views and associations? Now, in this case, I think what you've got is a clash of two privileges or contempts: the claim of Congress that this information is relevant to the discharge of his function, and the claim of the electorate that having to reveal this would strip him of the privilege which is necessary for the preservation of his function. Now, I think at that point I would resort to a notion of hierarchy and say that the electorate is a higher tribunal whose demands take precedence over the lower tribunal.
Because of the theory of democracy.
Because of the theory of democracy, which, so far as I can see at this point, means that the electoral tribunal is the highest within the system.
How about labeling, Joe? How about labeling? You go back to your original, the idea you spoke about in the first 5 minutes. This is a statement by labeling. I suppose you mean only that men should state their interest when they're engaged in any consequential kind of communication. Or do you come out with labeling?
I think I indicated when I raised the labeling thing, you're reminding us, that I said it intersected with another problem, the protected privacy thing. And I think, I don't think I recognize that the electorate needs and can well stand administrative help in the forming of its judgment by requiring some kind of labeling. Although I recognize that under some circumstances, the requirement that you identify yourself effectively deters or deprives a person. If identifying yourself as a long-standing member of this front organization, of this party, means that your customers won't appear when you try to give them haircuts, for instance, we have in a sense effectively deprived a person of freedom of speech. That is, by way of simply making the exercise of the opportunity so fraught with consequences that it's unreasonable to suppose that he's taught. You have to be a hero in order to make a speech, and I don't think a good system of free speech You have to be somewhat heroic in any circumstances about this one. Yes.
If I understand you, you say that there is a sort of positive formulation of what privileged speech is for senators, and that it would be desirable for government to make a kind of positive code of what should be privilege for ordinary citizens.
Well, I don't think that's so much necessarily the positive code as the acceptance of the principle that that there are certain communication activities of the citizen which enjoy protection by the extension of the principle of privilege. Now, I think one can argue, and I think my clue here is from Professor Mickeljohn's argument, that in fact the First Amendment should be taken as an explicit statement of the privilege of the electorate. That's what the First Amendment is. The First Amendment is an attempt, and incidentally, so much that Professor Mickeljohn has relied on, found in the Fifth Amendment's provision for life, liberty, or property without due process of law, the warrant to deal reasonably and wisely with communication activity which in other ways involves the clash between, let's say, the aggressive character or just the wisdom of allowing people to enter your living room through your television set and try to sell you things, that these are regulable by due process. I understand this as saying that the First Amendment should receive a fairly narrow reading in this sense, as designed to extend to the electorate the privileges which Congress is given, let's say, through the explicit grant of legislative power and the implied grant of privilege and the explicit grant, incidentally, of that shall not be made to answer in another place. Mr. Gorman?
I just, as a structural point here, apart from whether any differences or would be develop any differences between us, so see if I'm wrong structurally. We began yesterday with you saying we were interested in the scope of the concern of government with the mind. Well, that was generally the mind, but now it's narrowed to the mind of the citizenry as such.
And it's communication life only.
Yes. Now, for the moment at least, at the end here, we're at, if I took it properly, an assertion that your argument, especially if you had a chance to fully develop and protect it and so on all the way, that your argument leads to the assertion of an obligation on the part of the government, a valid power on the part of the government, to make arrangements for the citizenry as an implication of the theory of democracy that gives them powers in the office of citizenship, powers appropriate to citizenship.
Right.
Now, just a structural point, because there may be a possible argument in there somewhere, you made a jump, and I think that's all I wanted to say is to point out that you did make a jump. It could be argued, and I would myself, I'm pretty sure, so argue, that the philosophy of democracy entails the consequence, that's the nerve of your last proposition, namely the consequence that full powers for being in a position to judge their government in its instrumental activities on their behalf, full political power for occupying the office of citizenship is something that has to be arranged if there's to be consistency with what the democratic idea entails. Now, but the jump is, has to be arranged by whom? Has to be arranged by the instrumental government, occupying the special privileges of their office with the powers that go with it, which do involve the coercive dimension of law, which is the characteristic act of government.
Not the characteristic one, but the example one.
I think law is the characteristic act of government, but let's pass that by for the moment. But will you acknowledge that you did take a jump, because it is possible to go as far as you did, and I go that way with you, and still say it is up to the people, now talking about the people, not as an aggregate of scattered individuals, but this political entity, the people, who is the principal ruler in this democratic nation. It is possible for them to make arrangements to impart this power to themselves in various ways in society, and to have great apprehension about how much use they make of their instrumental government as regards imparting this power. For example, they may decide that a continuing spiritual institution, the profession of teaching, is the one to which they wish to delegate most of their powers as regards their trying to give to themselves what they need to occupy their political office, and decide to give very little to the government. Now, apart from that argument, am I not right that you jumped over that?
I don't think I jumped over it. I accept the fact that, and I go a long way with your formulation of it, that the people acting, I take this as a political act, the people acting in its political capacity, has then the responsibility, among other things, for making sure that the minds which are given the opportunity for communicate have the capacity developed to make the judgments that are necessary, and that then the question of the educational arrangements which it undertakes in the other aspect of the government of mind, which I indicated, which I thought the government of the educational institutions was another part of this whole enterprise that I'm concerned with, may, as a matter of wisdom, be said to take the form of delegation to a wide variety of institutions.
I go on with John, that your title originally kind of prejudices the argument because the government of mind, the government does suggest the government.
Well, but this is the government.
Granted,
I regard it as a government act to say that there shall be parochial schools supported by public funds, and that attendance on these is a legitimate substitute for public education attendance requirements. I regard that as a political act of great wisdom, but a political act.
No, but I was talking, all right.
Mr. Calvin? This is, I think, in line with Bill's question. I think I have the same sense he does, that there's a jump in this is independently the merits of the argument, there's a jump in the exposition of it at this point. It seems to me that to recapitulate what you did, I think it might be very easy to correct the place where the jump occurs. That you first advance the notion of privilege as an interesting and different way of looking at the claims of free communication. And then you reread the First Amendment to us. I mean, you had a new draft of it. And it seems to me at that point the verbs used in the redraft of the First Amendment involves the gap. I mean, the verbs all became positive instead of why did you drop the language about abridgment at that point? I mean, would you mind going back and rereading that reading of the First Amendment you gave us? I think I make my point very explicit.
Well, I don't know whether I did that off the cuff or let's see. Government shall maintain and develop an appropriate system of protected opportunities for communication.
Now, where do you get shall maintain and develop out of shall not abridge, even granting that this is a privilege? I mean, just as a matter of...
Well, the maintain and develop is independent of that, not precluded by the language of abridge. When you ask what it is that you're prevented from abridging, it turns out to be a system of legitimate, and here I come back to the notion of legitimate communication.
Wouldn't the more normal reading of that be that the theory here was a kind of limited one, that the government would support these privileged areas of communication by not abridging them? And that was all. That's as far as
by not abridging what? See,
the privileged opportunity, the appropriate opportunities for speech, whatever you want to call it.
Except that if you include as part of the definition of freedom of speech the provision for protections and privilege, these do not exist in the absence of deliberate government action.
Privilege is made, in other words, it doesn't exist independent of the construction of the whole network of government, I suppose, would be your privilege.
Can I take a shot at Barry's question?
It seems to me that protected covers that bridge that you are speaking of, that gap that you're speaking of.
It seems to be kind of I don't know, I disagree with the conclusion, except there seems to be kind of a non sequitur in this line.
I don't think there is. Can I take a shot at his question? I noticed the gap, but I think it is absolutely necessary because there are two different types of things which have been talked about here. They are logically very different things, and everything has to be said differently with respect to them. The first one, in order to keep a communication system going, as I understand it, you have to have two types of conditions. And the first one is what I call the necessary condition. Without it, not. Freedom in the press is something like this. And these ought to be privileged in a certain way. If you don't have them, there is no such thing as a communication system. On the other hand, there are, in addition to this, and this is the second type, certain non-logical things guaranteed or interdicted by government, which have a very different status, which are not necessary conditions, but which the government will nevertheless guarantee or interdict, not because the government is logical, but because it has wisdom. For example, a law forbidding blasphemy and another one forbidding insulting the Pope exist in Italy, although they don't exist here. The second is obviously no necessary condition for communication. However, it is, granted the social situation in Italy, a very wise one because it protects a value. Namely the majesty of the supreme author of the universe and his vicar, assuming they can't protect their own majesty. So these are two very different things, and everything that is said about one type of condition has to be systematically different from everything which is said about the other type of condition, because they have different logical properties. And I think this is where you get the notion, the feeling of a jump.
No, I'll have to think about it. I mean, I don't quite get the sequence into all I
has the last word.
This is just, again, a question that I put to you, which I ask you to take up tomorrow, because in some sense the two questions are too large. But these are the problems that I felt some difficulty in as you went along. The argument was sketched, so in one sense this is an unfair question. I asked you just to fill it in. You made out a whole case involving the phrase normal consequences, and in doing that you gave a historical description of the manner in which it had ordinarily been maintained that speech has the right to be interfered with for all sorts of harm that it does to the community. I would prefer you to make that case out not historically but evaluatively. In other words, for me that case is still deficient because all you've done is shown that in various times in the past this has been the nature of the understanding of society, which doesn't have any evaluative weight with me. It doesn't show me that previous societies were wise. It only shows me that this was the nature of the precedent which existed. This is favorable to the atmosphere that you are creating in indicating that for long periods of time, for example, this was the condition, and consequently we ought not to look at our own situation as having been the perennial one, and there are other ways of forming this problem. I see the validity in that, but I'd still like you to, if you would, tomorrow go back over and make out a stronger case for the wisdom of this policy, not just for the fact that it has existed in the past.
Let me just indicate now, I think these reflect some wisdom, and I wouldn't make the case purely on the grounds of historical.
Now, I come to a problem which I can put both to you and to Dr. Meiklejohn, which you may both answer tomorrow, perhaps. I think you both have the problem in part. That's why I say it this way. If one is asked finally why privileges are granted to an individual, as far as you've gone today, and so far as I understand Professor Meiklejohn, the reason for granting the privilege is because of the role that the individual plays as a citizen in constructing the democratic representational government. Now, Dr. Meiklejohn has often been pressed with a criticism, which he's attempted to answer, and I read a recent answer of his, in regard to the arts, for example. In what conceivable sense are the communications of arts relevant to the function of forming government? Now, he answers that quite well in part, but I think he's nevertheless stuck with a difficulty which leads to the kind of criticism we made yesterday. I'm inclined to think that no matter how brilliantly he makes use of any of the sociological phenomena connected with music, he will not protect the right to create music and to transcribe it on the basis of its function in forming government. I simply think that cannot be done. Now, in your case, when the problem of privilege arises in terms of the citizenry, I want to know whether the sole function for which the citizenry is granted its privilege is its function as citizenry. In other words, is when the government asks, when a government committee calls me before it and inquires, for example, into my sexual experiences, is my reason for being privileged the fact that somehow or other my private access to my own information about sexual experience is something which provides me a better opportunity for citizenship? I don't think that answer is really
no, not for citizens.
You see, I think there's an area here where we touch on the problem that both Bill and I raised yesterday about whether the function of government is the total function with which human beings ought to be concerned, and whether there aren't both other associations like that between a man and a woman, which are in some sense still, I'm back in the classic mold, beyond the realm of government, and furthermore, whether there aren't individual capacities, those dealing with freedom of choice, which I take seriously, which are again independent of the functions of government. Not that government has to grant me the privilege.
Well, they do. They grant you the privilege of marriage, among other things. I mean, the relation between man and woman is not altogether immune from the concern of the government in many ways. Look, I'd want to say, without answering it now...
In many ways, it's not equivalent to always, though, and that's the gap.
Let me say, first, part of the privilege, the connection of privilege, so far as it mitigates what I call the normal consequences, is, I think, tied up with the notion of function or a relation which is protected because society values it, among other things. I think the marriage relation or others don't have to be justified. The government is concerned to enhance these and does so by providing them with a whole range of protections. And it's not only because this is part of government. But I would say in addition to that, if you want to know, how about just sort of innocent merriment, communication as person's self-expression, a whole lot of other things? I think this is a form of activity which is very valuable, and like any other form of activity, subject to our wisdom in governing it.
And now there's a key ambiguity in the phrase, society grants or society recognizes.
The government does.
The government does.
I like that acting through our political institutions.
I like that even less. But then the ambiguity becomes for me, does the government grant it as being a form of activity which in some sense enhances the public good, or does government grant it because it recognizes in its wisdom that it doesn't belong within the realm of government?
It recognizes because in its wisdom it recognizes that part of the public function is to enhance the private lives of individuals.
This concludes the recorded part of the discussion. During the following day's meeting, Mr. Tussman referred to the discussion which had continued during lunch.
One word about something I've stressed, which I think I've been reminded, especially by Mr. Gorman, rather wisely, and I appreciate it, that I've been stressing the aggressive character of communication, or that aspect of it which is aggressive. And I guess I have to remind myself, and say that I'm aware now, certainly, that there's something built into the notion of communication which is essentially non-aggressive and competitive. It is the notion of communion, or community, or of communing. And that to see communication entirely in terms of the hurling of one body against another and manipulation is fundamentally to misunderstand the whole conception of language. So I do want to, just in passing, say here that one of the ways of judging a good system of communication, that is, whether we've succeeded in creating a satisfactory system of protected opportunities for discussion, is in the end not how many occasions and what are the specific protections, but once you've dealt with the problem of aggressive uses of these in the wide variety of ways I dealt with last time, whether in fact the communication life of that society is enhancing the peace and the creation of a community.
You have been listening to the second of 4 staff discussions of A Theory of the First Amendment. Joseph Tussman, professor of philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley, discussed with the staff material from a book he is preparing titled Government of the Mind. Participating in the discussion were the chairman, Mr. Robert M. Hutchins, Alexander Mickeljohn, former president of Amherst College, Harry Calvin, Jr. of the University of Chicago Law School, Purcell Weaver, and staff members Frank Kelly, W. H. Ferry, William Gorman, Richard Lichtman, Harvey Wheeler, Harry S. Ashmore, and John Wilkinson. We hope you will join us for the 3rd discussion in this series. This is Halleck Hoffman speaking from the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara.